who's guesting on this entire inquiry, as well as our two witnesses that we have for this first panel. And what I will do is start by asking you both a question and then giving you the opportunity to introduce yourselves as you answer that question. The committee has understands that between I think it's 88% and 90% of revenues for social media platforms of Meta, TikTok, X and Google as a search engine, up to 98% of their revenues comes from advertising. Advertising is therefore a critical part of the business model, the biggest and most important part of the business model of social media companies. And so my first question to you is, do the business models of social media companies rely on or encourage the spread of harmful content? If I could start with you, Dr. Karen Middleton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for inviting me to this inquiry and giving me the opportunity to talk about my research and an area that I feel very strongly about and have been looking at for the last couple of years. I'm Dr. Karen Middleton, Senior Lecturer in Marketing at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm also a voluntary advisor to the Conscious Advertising Network. I've been with them for 2 years as well. Just to answer your question about the underlying business model of social media and how that is fundamentally advertising, I would give an emphatic yes, but I would also say that it's not just social media, it's effectively the internet in broad terms, in terms of how websites, if they use advertising, then that can be something that enables them to exist. And there is a lot of money to be made from online advertising. Estimates at $1 trillion for 2025. So yes, in answer to the question, I would agree with that. And you're also asking, how does this business model spread misinformation and online harm? So kind of 4 areas to look at with that. The first one is the algorithms that social media and other websites use to serve content and to serve advertising to the users. Inherently, content and people's interest in staying online is very often driven by sensationalist content, content that is enraging, content that is emotional. So that very fact that is kind of a fact of human nature drives the engagement, and the algorithms have no differential between, deciding whether something might be harmful if it's spread, and deciding what the nature of that content is and the effect it might have. So in themselves, those algorithms do prioritize harmful content, by definition. So in terms of moving on from that in itself, which we could call the attention economy, which has been, in existence since the advent of newspapers, so many years. The second point around the fundamental business model of advertising online is that what has emerged from this ecosystem is a proliferation of advertising fraud. So there are a lot of websites that are really used for clickbait, to make money from advertising. So those websites are often fraudulent. They're often based on fake news websites, as we saw with the Southport riots, Channel 3 now. And so within that context, ad fraud has the same amount of same lack of transparency as those algorithms and are part of that sort of harmful system. In itself, those fraudulent advertising networks may often fund criminal activity, but they could be seen as the disinformation economy. So it serves the purposes of fraudulent advertising websites because of that tendency towards contentious, enraging content to proliferate that kind of content to get clicks and to benefit from advertising. A third point I would make is something that has already been mentioned in previous meetings of this inquiry, in particular by Mariana Spring, that these algorithms in their scale and their prioritization of this kind of content, as well as spreading harmful content and misinformation, they also very much normalize this kind of content, and that the media in itself cultivates certain societal norms. There's a type of credibility associated with things that are in writing, that are online, and in essence, this is kind of publishing of content which is often seen by users as true, because it is so commonplace and it is spread online. And really underlying that, the fourth point I would make is that the major platforms, and there are obviously some dominating platforms, Google and Meta tend to dominate the market, but they face little scrutiny. They face that they're not regulated in the same way as other media has been previously, before the advent of online media. So those things kind of set the context, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karen Middleton. Phil Smith, I think that's an unequivocal confirmation from our first witness that the business models of social media companies rely on and encourage the spread of harmful content, and that advertising is a fundamental part of that. What is your response?
Thank you, Chair, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. My name is Phil Smith. I'm the Director General of ISBA. We represent the UK's leading brand advertisers. I think with qualification, I would give you some agreement. Look, in general, where maximum audience and attention are rewarded, there are attendant risks, as there are with other media. It is especially so for social media, where content is generated at vast scale and it's served on the basis of engagement. Now, most highly engaging content is harmless. Think of cat videos, but some is clearly not. And users with harmful interests can connect readily with victims or with collaborators. And that risk becomes particularly evident in fast-moving crises like last summer's riots or after the George Floyd murder 5 years ago in the United States. The platform's historic lack of liability for what they carry has compounded this issue, I believe. We should acknowledge, though, that over the last 7 years, there has been huge investment by the major platforms in offsetting these risks, employing tens of thousands of people in content moderation and building automated detection, as well as in transparency reporting and audit. Now, this has been encouraged by brand advertisers. And we should also note that there are some smaller platforms which appear to have fewer issues in this regard. Pinterest, for example, claims to prioritize positivity in its content recommendation, and there have been fewer concerns about harmful content reported in this from that platform. Scale, of course, may be a factor.
So, Phil Smith, as a representative of the advertising sector, you agree that attention maximization will drive harmful content. Are you saying that the measures that the platforms have taken, that you described, that some of them have taken them now, helps to address that? Or what more do you think, what more are you proposing needs to be done?
I'm saying that there are greater attendant risks with social media of harmful content spreading. I do believe that the major platforms have taken very large steps and made investments to offset those risks. The question of whether enough is enough is a difficult one to answer, because with some of the most severe harmful content, zero tolerance is all that we could allow. It is encouraging that the Online Safety Act, which we've supported since its inception, is now coming into its first major tranche of enactment. And we believe that the Online Safety Act needs to be seen to be a positive force in forcing platforms to remove illegal content, as it intends to do, very promptly.
Well, I think we will come to discussing the Online Safety Act and its impact, though you talk about illegal content. This committee is most concerned with harmful content and misinformation. Martin, did you have a point to raise here?
Thank you, Chair. I think you've both touched upon this, talking about the historic lack of accountability for these systems that we refer to as platforms. Now, there was a big debate in the early days of these systems as to whether they were platforms, thus not accountable, or publishers, thus accountable. Do you think that the way they work today, with recommendation engines, with curation and effective editorial selection, has actually moved them from the realms of platforms to publishers?
I would say yes, and I am familiar with that question. I must admit, I'm not really clear on why they would not be considered to be publishers, considering this information is pushed out at scale and is in the public domain. Perhaps, Phil, you would say something about this, because very much I'm confused as to why they wouldn't be considered to be platforms rather than publishers.
It was early days regulation decisions that took them to become platforms, and thus not liable for the content they had on their neutral platform, as opposed to a publisher who has editorial choice and thus liability for what they publish.
Phil Smith?
Mr. Smith?
And in particular, Section 230 in the United States gave them zero liability for what they carried. I'm not sure whether the distinction between publisher and platform is a useful one here, but I think what is really useful is whether or not they are liable for what they carry. And I think that is that is clearly something that the Online Safety Act is intending to address, and that's why we've been keen for oversight and regulation going back to 2018.
Thank you.
You've mentioned the Online Safety Act, which deals with illegal content. It's not as clear it's not as clear in implementation or in the details of the Act what its approach is to misinformation, which is what we are considering here. But the lack of clarity about the algorithms by which the social media's platforms distribute content, but also the way in which the digital advertising processes are also designed, which drive the financial incentives for the platforms. Is it fair to say, Karen Middleton, that the technology sector has designed digital advertising processes to be complex and opaque with minimal human oversight?
I would answer that by saying I'm not sure there is an intentional drive to do that. It's probably more to do with how it's emerged and how the technology has emerged and the need to do things at scale. But there is a very complex and opaque supply chain, nevertheless. And I would say that these kind of harms that we see from this process are could be described more as I say, unintentional outcomes, but nevertheless, these unintentional outcomes that drive misinformation and harmful content are in themselves profitable. So there's no drive to change those for those that benefit from it. So in terms of the digital advertising system, there are many layers, but it's broadly within kind of 4 layers, where you have advertisers who then liaise with demand middlemen, then supplier middlemen, and then the websites or platforms where the advertising is placed. So that in itself obviously creates opacity, but it also means that many of those actors within the supply chain don't have awareness of where their advertising is placed. They don't have full control of the system because of the scale and the different options, and the fact that programmatic advertising itself relies on real-time bidding of engagement. So there isn't the opacity there for those reasons. And I would also add that, I think there is a huge amount of, this is probably something that we'll go on to talk about, but within the advertising ecosystem, especially with the smaller companies and those in that supply chain, there is a huge level of uncertainty and sense of responsibility over this problem. However, there remains a lack of control because of the disjointed nature of the supply chain and the lack of opacity and requirement for that to be made clear by the different levels in that system.
Can the government, or do you think the government should act to require greater clarity, and what would you recommend or propose?
I think one of the key levers for that would be to actually recognise this problem and this. I'm not sure if I'd use such a strong word as malpractice, but in terms of this is a financial incentive, and as such, I would suggest that it should be considered by the Financial Conduct Authority. As well as other regulators or organisations, the government within this realm. We talked previously in previous briefings about the Advertising Standards Authority, which I don't know if we'll go on to talk about that in more detail, but the Advertising Standards Authority are a self-regulatory body. They are not government funded. They do lots of positive work, obviously, for the industry in helping to regulate, but it's much more about the content of advertising itself rather than anything about the ecosystem and how that might drive harm, which is generally recognised as a problem only in recent years. So perhaps there is a situation where it's not caught up.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Phil Smith, we've heard that it's how adverts are placed where is somewhat opaque. Do you agree that advertisers are often outraged to find out where their ads end up online, and how should this be addressed?
If I may, though, Chair, I'd like to go back to the earlier question and just to give a bit more clarification. When you talk about complexity and opaqueness, I would in general agree, but I think that you have to be specific about which parts of the sector you're talking about. When you talk about the walled garden platform environments like Facebook or X or Instagram, for example, advertisers can buy directly from those platforms, and indeed, of course, their processes are automated, and there are questions about where ads appear, but there are services which allow you to see where your ads have appeared. The most opaque segment in the market, which the previous speaker talked to, is programmatic advertising on the open web, on websites. And that's particularly complicated and opaque because, as has been said, there are many steps and actors in the supply chain. So you have agencies, you have demand-side platforms, supply-side platforms before the money gets to the publisher. And ISBA has conducted studies with advertisers and publishers over the years which demonstrate this complexity and the flows of money. In our last study in 2021, as an example, the average number of websites that were included in a campaign was 9,000. So a lot of advertising going to a lot of websites with a lot of lack of clarity about where that was going. And going back to the earlier point, this is where these made-for-advertising websites proliferate, where they have poor or false content designed to attract audiences cheaply. To your point about brands and advertisers and their reaction, of course they're hugely concerned, and ISBA has led multiple representations to platforms over the years. For example, when it was found in 2017 that brands were advertising on terrorist propaganda videos and sharing revenue with its creators. We've also participated in the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, which was the voluntary effort which sought greater levels of transparency on user safety and control over ad placement. As you will be aware, that this activity has now been discontinued as a result of a lawsuit from X, which claims that the alliance was collusive in nature, which is being contested by the World Federation of Advertisers. So we've always been clear that advertisers have to make their individual spending decisions based on their own priorities, and that advertisers should not seek to influence content, but should demand clarity on policy and assurance on the effectiveness of the policy implementation. And that's what we have sought to do in the individual clarification and guidance that we give to our members on a regular basis.
Thank you. John.
Thank you, Chair. Phil, I just wanted to come in on that slightly further. And I've been looking at a study done by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which looked at harmful eating disorder videos being recommended to children as young as 13. And these videos included what I eat in a day, a video showing extreme calorie restrictions, Finspiration, a video presenting skeletal bodies as inspiring, ABC, the anorexia boot camp, a diet video of 0 to 500 calories and extreme diet. And what the Centre for Countering Digital Hate found was that brands, very senior brands like L'Oreal, Ralph Lauren, were being shown next to some of these harmful content. Should we be doing more to protect children online? How should we be doing that? Is there a responsibility for the advertisers? And is there more that we should be demanding from the platforms in terms of how they protect young children online?
Yeah. I think the first thing to say is we've always said that more needs to be done to ensure that harmful content does not appear on platforms or on the web at large. The regulation of that is a matter for government. Advertisers definitely want to see a break in the link between their advertising and the funding of that content, and have fought hard to make sure that they have more control over where ads get placed. Of course, content like that is unacceptable. The appearance of advertising next to it is not going to be acceptable to the advertisers either. But what I would suggest is that it's a collective effort if that's going to get to a place where we see no recurrence of this.
Thank you, Phil.
Can I ask a follow-up? Sorry, Phil. I'm just going to push you a bit there, because you say that's up to government, and we fully accept it's up to government to regulate in this area. But what is it that government could actually do to give this transparency to advertisers so that their content doesn't appear next to harmful content? And it's not just Meta, TikTok as well. Given the algorithm of pushing this kind of eating disorder material, Instagram as well. Those are proliferate sites.
Well, the platforms themselves would say that they provide a lot of control to advertisers over where their ads appear these days. In particular, Meta is introducing and continues to introduce controls over placement based on brand suitability. Those controls are clearly not perfect, and we see those issues coming through where both the content is unacceptable and where the placement from the point of view for the advertiser is unacceptable. But there are services available which advertisers do often use, which examine in detail where their ads have appeared next to, and those are third-party organisations, some of which have been independently verified.
Sorry, I don't think that answers my question. Apologies, but you said that the government should do more to protect on a harmful content and to bring transparency. I'm trying to get to the bottom of what you think government should do.
Well, first of all, we think the Online Safety Act needs to be allowed to take effect. A major tranche of its powers come into effect this week. That will work on illegal content. I think when it comes to where advertisers place their ads, we're currently not asking government to do anything.
I think that's a really important point that Emily's making, Phil Smith, there. If the sector, the industry, is not asking for any change when it comes to the transparency or control of the placements of ads, then the advertisers have to accept the responsibility that they have when those adverts are funding harmful content, which we see is happening.
I think there are some distinctions to be made here. In some settings, advertising does lead to a revenue share with the creator, and that's clearly unacceptable for any advertiser to be happening. And there has to be a responsibility there for the platforms and for the advertisers themselves. In other circumstances, you're seeing advertising that's appearing in a newsfeed environment where harmful content also appears. Now, advertisers don't wish to see that happen either. But if there is funding of the platform, it's not going to the creator necessarily. So I think that link is something we need to be careful when you try to make those connections. Of course, advertisers want to see their ads appearing in the right places, and they work hard with the platforms to drive for better standards of clarity around that, and they work hard with independent third parties to check where those campaigns are going. I'd also say that when it comes to the advertiser community, one thing that we should remember is that while brand advertisers will be spending large amounts of effort and money on these activities, the universe for the number of advertisers on big platforms and in the web at large is very large. So ISBA represents 200 of the biggest advertisers in the UK. There are 3.5 million SMEs advertising in the UK, and we know that platforms like Meta, for example, like TikTok, will have many millions of advertisers whose primary concern is about response to their advertising, and who don't have the brands that they've invested in for years and years to build their reputation.
Can I just come back again, Phil? So what you're saying, in a newsfeed environment, so your TikToks, your Instagrams, your Facebooks, there may be harmful content. Do you see that there is a consequence to brands of being near that harmful content in a newsfeed environment? And I appreciate what you're saying, that it's not going to the creator of that content, but I guess are your members happy for TikTok to be making the money off the back of the advertisers being placed near this harmful content?
No, they're not. And we have worked very hard with platforms to create adjacency controls to allow advertisers to have more control over where their content appears. So those controls increasingly are coming into place on the major platforms through voluntary action of the type that we've talked about before. I think
that's the hub of the nub of the issue here, Phil Smith, is that you feel that the voluntary action is appropriate, and that either it's going to change for the better, or the existing situation is acceptable. Just to emphasise Emily's point, I think in addition to the implications of the revenue point, if a reputable brand like L'Oreal or Unilever is appearing there, even if the content isn't sharing that revenue, it is sharing the reputation of the brand. So that that is also it is normalising the misinformation or the harmful content which is there. So I just want us to be very clear: is ISBA and the sector that you represent And I know that you are incredibly dependent on certain big players in the advertising sectors we talked about, but are you calling for regulatory or legislative change? Or are you asking the committee to wait and see how things evolve?
We would certainly like to see the impact that the Online Safety Act has on content and content moderation. We're not asking for action in the arena of adjacency control for advertising at this stage. We are seeing from the major platforms big investment in adjacency control and in the ability for advertisers to place their advertising next to suitable content. Now, there are other platforms which are not making similar investments. They're not necessarily being rewarded with advertisers' money. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the advertiser, it's very hard to walk away from spending with a major platform which has such a large audience, particularly amongst younger people, at a time when traditional media is losing its grip there. So what I'm saying is that the voluntary action is having an effect, and while the system is not perfect, I believe that we are seeing improvements there.
Yeah, I think you're also telling us that there is a power dynamic here which limits what what advertisers can call for. But I think we have.
I would agree with that.
You agree with that? Excellent. Martin and then John, quickly, and then we'll move on if that's.
So you might consider a slightly harsh view, but would you accept that advertisers funding these platforms are actually responsible for this and should pay the consequences? Would that encourage you to get better regulation if that were the case?
I think it's a very, very hard thing for an advertiser to do, individually, to walk away from a major platform with such a huge and popular audience, which is operating legally in this country, and which has mass appeal when it is striving to compete with other players who are advertising on that platform. So, collective action is clearly an illegal thing in this country, and it's not something that ISBA could ever encourage its advertisers to do. Advertisers have to make their own minds up individually, but it's a competitive market.
Collective action is illegal in the extent to which it would be anti-competitive. That's very helpful. John.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just following up on that point, Phil, if advertisers aren't willing to walk away from these platforms because this is the space in which they need to advertise and to promote their products, what pressure are they placing on the platforms? And can we see it? Where is the pressure when content such as promoting anorexic lifestyles to 13-year-olds, where can we see the pressure from the advertising industry in terms of how they've pushed back against what the platforms are doing?
Well, I can give you specific examples. So if I go back to 2017 and Brands Funding Terror, which was the headline on the Times, ISBA with its members went in and met with YouTube and Google and asked for greater transparency, asked for greater control over their ad placements. In the following year, we saw transparency reporting coming from Google. We also saw the introduction of monetization thresholds, whereby creators weren't allowed into the advertising program to carry adverts until they had proved their bona fides. So there are definitely examples in the past 7 or 8 years where we have called meetings with platforms. We've gone in, we've sought to understand what the issues are. We've recognized that we are not competent in the area of content moderation, but we certainly are keen to ensure that the platforms are healthy environments for their users, and also that our ads appear in the right places.
Thank you, Phil. Just quickly then, given you've mentioned back in 2017, ISBA and some of your members took that action, do you think it's time you went back to the platforms, given that there is still harmful content and it's still being connected to advertisers, that you go back to them and make further transparency and control demands?
We do as and when the situation demands, and we would have had meetings with platforms after Southport, for example, last year. The other effort that was critical to the work that we were doing was the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, where brand advertisers were able to speak with a single voice and work with the platforms on improving transparency, on improving improving controls over placement, and ensuring that there was clarity that was coming out for advertisers when it came to the policies that were enforced, as well as a degree of transparency about the effectiveness of their enforcement. That is something which is currently the subject of legal action, so don't really want to talk too much about that. But that was a major effort with global advertisers, and ISBA sat on the steering committee of that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Phil, before we move on to Adam, can you just confirm, do the brands that you represent, or perhaps you can write to the committee, is their market capitalization or their revenues, is it greater or lesser than the platforms? Do you have greater financial influence, would you say, or power in the market than the platforms?
I would say without question we have less financial power. We could provide some numbers around that, but clearly, we are a local advertising association. Many of our members are global, but nonetheless, they are their local market companies. And in terms of concentration of the market, we have a very small number of platforms which have a very high share of an advertising market, which all advertisers need to use to access.
Thank you.
So there is definitely an imbalance.
That's very helpful. Adam.
Thank you, Chair. And Cameron, I'm going to come back to you now and focus specifically on Google, because we've had a longer conversation about advertising generally, but it's very well established now that Google is highly dominant in global advertising ecosystem, holds about 90% of the share on the sell side and somewhere between 40 and 80% on the buy side. In your opinion, what do you think this means for bad practices in the advertising sector, such as the monetization of harmful content that we've been discussing?
Thank you. I think one of the key things that that you would call that you would think about in terms of that dominance is the inability of other players to enter the market, and the fact that there is a clear gap around platforms that have safety by design. So Google and generally the existing platforms haven't followed safety by design principles. So, to the previous discussion, there are, of course, there are financial incentives for advertisers and platforms to not be regulated and to manage their own affairs, because these things are playing off safety with profit, and that's the nub of what we're looking at here. So that dominance allows that power balance allows the opacity and the suppression of information about how they work, along with the lack of regulation of that issue, but also the fact that it means that other players aren't able to enter the market. I mean, as the previous discussion was unfolding, obviously there is a tension between, of course, what the business interests are and the safety interests. So I think that is certainly where there is a regulatory gap, where different levers should be applied to the industry, because from within the advertising industry itself, there is the incentive to protect economic interests, which may be at odds with online safety. So there are different levers, not least that in first of all the reputation risks of those companies themselves, but they are not in themselves going to be enough, I think, to really address the problem. Some other potential regulatory levers might be around the EU legislation or regulation on corporate sustainability reporting directive, which actually looks at supply chain. At the moment, advertising is not considered within that directive, but there is a possibility for that in the future, which is something that the Conscious Advertising Network are looking at, around responsibility within supply chains. So, this is generally a problem of the lack of regulation of this environment, and so it of course, not sure, keep repeating the point, but it's incumbent upon government to find those levers, I think, and there are, in terms of Ofcom's regulation, a case of waiting to see. There are already gaps that exist that we know about. Obviously, it's a very fast-moving environment. One of the things I wanted to say, if I may, are, as well as regulation coming on board, is current developments with some of the platforms, including Meta's move to roll back on terms of service, which a report by the CCDH has estimated would mean that 97% of the content that they previously removed will not be removed. And so that definitely exposes the problem of content moderation in itself, because it relies on the platform having particular terms of service, but also it's removing content once it's already out there. So I think the regulatory approach would make it more incumbent upon any of the services to ensure that they have the right kind of safety by design.
So a couple of questions from that, Karen, and thank you for that answer. You talked repeatedly about safety by design. I think that's come through very clearly, and the difficulty for competition entering into the market. Do you think that more competition will make a difference to the spread of harmful content, or is the business model itself to blame? And then you also talked about the government should be doing more. We asked Phil a few minutes ago about what he thought the government should be doing. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Okay, so a few questions. What should the government be doing? But sorry, what's your previous question?
The first question was, do you think more competition would make a difference to the spread of harmful content?
I think that in terms of competition, it's very difficult. There are barriers to entry, and there is market dominance. So I don't think we could take a competitive position to say that would, by natural market forces, reduce the problem. Neither the reputation risk is not necessarily going to be enough to reduce the problem. Companies themselves can, I think, advance their own contractual arrangements. They can do further risk assessment of how this might, these algorithms and this prioritization of certain content that is monetized may have an effect on their own reputation, but that in itself I don't think is enough to drive progress. And I think that it's incumbent upon those authorities that are in this space, which would be the ASA, Information Commissioner's Office, Ofcom, and, as I mentioned earlier, the Financial Conduct Authority potentially, to consider this. Obviously, we need to consider economic interests of those companies, but just relying on that is not going to deliver the safety by design outcomes.
Your thoughts on what government could be doing more than it is currently doing? Ofcom
to date haven't mentioned anything about misinformation. I think there was a previous there is a online advertising task force, but it hasn't talked about this issue. So I think that would be something that could be a development. So to my knowledge, alongside those other kind of bodies actually looking voicing that this is a problem to be addressed. It's not going to be addressed overnight, but it's something that is in the responsibility of this industry.
Thanks, Karen. And my last question for you. You talked about companies could be doing more as well, and given the dominance that Google has in the space, do you think Google is doing enough to avoid monetizing harmful content?
They are not, from where I can see things, that they're not. I know in the previous one of the meetings of this inquiry, they did talk about an API that they are releasing, so that is a positive step. But they do command a high proportion of this marketplace, of course. They do devote resources to content moderation. However, there is not enough in terms of safety by design, I don't think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Karen. And Phil, sorry, I'm going to come back to you. So previous interventions such as the online advertising programme and task force and the intermediary platform principles pilot, where do you think they have fallen short on tackling harms in the digital advertising market?
Let me start by saying I think all of those initiatives have a different end in mind. If the issue we're really talking about here is harmful content, we've talked obviously a lot about the Online Safety Act. If government believes that the Online Safety Act needs to go further and further harms need to be included within the scope of that, then clearly that's something that government would need to consult on, and ISBA would be really happy to help in that regard. I mean, clearly misinformation does not currently fall within the scope of that. When it comes to the existing initiatives, the online advertising program is intended to address harmful advertising, not harmful content. And this is particularly ads that might be harmful to children. We've been deeply engaged in that work. We lead two of the working groups. I chair the one which is aiming to create benchmark data on how effectively advertisers of age-restricted products are targeting their ads when they follow the codes to adult audiences, where we believe we're actually doing a better job than legislators might think. The IPP, Intermediary and Platforms Protocol from the ASA is intended to bind platforms more closely into the ASA system, where the remit is about, as Karen has said, is about the content of ads. And as we move to a more automated, proactive system to ensure that advertisers are aware of their obligations, to the ASA, and all the indications from the pilot of that are that it's been successful. But its remit is different and limited compared to the scope of this inquiry, which is much more, in my view, about content and about how the business models drive that content.
Thank you, Phil. And then finally from me, you mentioned the UK online advertising programme. From your perspective, what's the sort of current status of that? Where's that work at the moment, and where do you see it kind of going in the next months and years?
Yeah, I think we will really see whether or not it has succeeded when we get to the autumn, when each of the working groups will be able to demonstrate that it has a plan in place to meet its goals. The progress that I've seen so far through the status updates are promising and encouraging.
Great, thank you, Phil. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Adam. And just to clarify, Phil Smith, you've spoken about those discussions about the online advertising program and task force and intermediary platform principles. You've emphasised that that's more about the content rather than about the process. Now, and you mentioned also the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, which was the voluntary cross-industry initiative which defined harmful online content and was the advertising sector trying to play a role in reducing the possibility of advertising supporting harmful content. And this, in August 2024, Musk sued GARM. Now, you implied that it was that legal proceedings were ongoing. Does GARM still exist? What is this? As far as you say, what is the status of that? And is it acceptable that an alliance for responsible media can be sort of hounded out of existence by the threat of suing?
I'll decline to comment on the last part of that question, but just to clarify on the facts, in August 2024, GARM stopped its existence. It was withdrawn by the World Federation of Advertisers. That lawsuit is ongoing, and a further tranche of advertisers have been added to the lawsuit by X. It is going to take some time for it to play its course through the courts in Texas.
That suit is happening in Texas, but GARM's activities have been suspended or closed globally.
Globally, they have.
So in that self-regulation or responsibility, responsible media has not been supported through self-regulation or industry groups in that particular example.
Well, you would say that there were a lot of participants in GARM from both sides of the fence who were very positive about what was being done, and one who was less than happy. And
the committee notes that Elon Musk, who sued GARM, also declined to appear before this committee and has indicated his view that this committee's proceedings are contrary to freedom of speech. He seems to be somewhat contrary to freedom of speech himself. In that case, right. But moving on now, I think Lauren.
Lovely, thank you. So we've touched a little bit there on kind of self-regulation. This is a question to you, Karen, if I can. So you kind of reported about maybe stricter codes. What can we be doing to really stop the practice of harmful digital marketing?
I think I would answer that question by the first step is clearly bringing the problem to light, which is obviously what we're trying to do here. But within those bodies that actually the problem is considered. I mean, it's to date, for example, the ASA has considered the content of advertising, but they are the Advertising Standards Authority. That doesn't limit them to only having that remit. You know, any in terms of looking at standards for advertising, surely if there's a large-scale problem such as the one that we have here, then that should be within the remit of a regulatory body, such as the Advertising Standards Authority. I mean, one of the recent codes that the Advertising Standards Authority have added is on advertising making environmental claims, which is reasonably broad and not so straightforward as what they've been looking at to date, which is harmful high fat, salt and sugar foods advertising, stereotyping, that kind of thing. Making environmental claims that are not justifiable by the organisation that would represent greenwash requires looking at the whole business practices of that organisation and making a judgment on whether that is greenwash or not. So there is a little bit of broadening out there, but if this body exists in order to assist the industry to practice responsibly and to maintain standards and not be associated with harm, then I don't see why they shouldn't bring something in. Obviously, this whole problem is very complicated and opaque and difficult to pin down, which is why I think that there would need to be a multi-level consideration of the problem and its outputs. So for the Advertising Standards Authority, it could issue guidance, for example, that advertisers should be aware of this potential problem and they should take steps to audit their supply chain. They should take steps to use the tools that Phil was talking about. They could perhaps do risk assessments and seek contractual agreements if possible. But obviously there is a recognition that there are larger and smaller organisations who have greater or lesser resource to do those things. But I guess the ASA could issue guidance on how advertisers and platforms and websites within this supply chain should be aware and can consider addressing this issue themselves.
I suppose it feels like the Wild West at the moment on the World Wide Web. And we can issue guidance, we can say here's best practice, but that means nothing unless there's actual teeth in enforcement. Would you propose a kind of a regulatory body that includes a kind of enforcement angle, and what would be a disincentive for bad practice?
Yeah, I mean the Ofcom fines. Obviously, we are waiting to see how that will be implemented. This is an area that draws a lot of passion, of course, and there has been a huge amount of positive work by Ofcom, but of course, only rightly there's criticism in terms of does it go far enough. But there is a kind of anticipation of whether this disincentive in fines will be actually taken up. But there is a strong from the outset, up to 10% of global income could represent a fine.
Just to clarify that, Dr. Middleton, that is for Ofcom's powers are with regard to fraudulent advertising.
I can't say that. Sorry.
Yes, and harmful illegal content.
Illegal content, yeah.
Their powers are not with regard to the process of advertising, or misinformation, which I think are the main concerns of this committee.
Absolutely. Sorry not to be clear on that. Exactly. Thank you. What I mean to say is that something similar to that, Ofcom have powers to impose fines. So, in terms of having teeth, Ofcom would be the only regulator, unless there was a new kind of regulator, which I don't know if that is very unlikely.
Thank you. Phil, do you have any comments on those questions?
Yes, I do. The ASA system is moving rapidly to an automated, proactive system that operates at scale. But its remit, which is funded by brand advertisers, is the regulation of legal advertising content by good actors trying to do the right thing. And it's not enforcement against illegal activity. And my other point would be that there is risk here of regulatory overlap. We already have the ICO, the Ofcom operating in this space, and we are talking in this committee about the interplay between content and advertising. And we, for our part, have been pretty clear that content is not the remit of advertisers to seek to regulate. And if there is more power that Ofcom needs in this environment, that's something that we think government would need to consider.
I think we've established that there isn't a regulator for the process of advertising. And it is the process of advertising which, as well as driving huge revenues and profits, also the committee has said evidence drives misinformation. And that is a regulatory gap. With that, I will move on. I think, Emily, you have a particular point to make. Yeah.
I do. Something that has come up quite a lot, and we had some of the families of bereaved teenagers at our previous session. And so I did want to ask Dr. Karen Middleton, in cases like the Molly Russell case, where it's very clear from the coroner's report that he believes that the exposure to harmful online content contributed to her death. Now, her family very much wants to see the messages and data for children that had died. And in fact, the coroner said it was quite difficult to get the information within his inquest. Should this data be shared with bereaved families, and should it be made easier for coroners to access this material?
In answer to your question for the first one, I don't think that as a matter of course families should be given this data, I think that could actually be very damaging and an invasion of privacy. But I think that the data should be available to the coroner if required, and that should be a decision for the coroner to take. It's not my particular area of expertise, but it's definitely something that I keep up with in terms of this research. And I believe that was proposed, but at the moment there is no requirement for the platforms to make that data available. So I think it should be made available to the coroner.
Yes, in fact, the government has moved, and it is within the Data Use and Access Bill, which is currently going through the Houses at the moment. I guess that it takes us back to the question that Martin posed. If these platforms are publishers, or who owns the content that is created on these, and who ultimately has the responsibility and accountability for the consequences of particularly young people being exposed to this material, and where the liability there lies.
Yeah. Yes. And I think your point about invasion of privacy, that would be unfortunately, this is the case. We're dealing specifically with the case of children who have lost their lives, and so where the families are desperately trying to understand what happened. And in the offline world, as it were, the families would inherit the access to any diaries or kind of notes, and it does seem that this is not is a case where the offline and the online world diverge.
Yeah, I also think it's quite important for us to understand the impact that this is having on particular behaviours, and in some of these behaviours leading to their own them taking their own lives, and how are we as a government to assess that if we do not actually have the data that shows one way or another the influence of it.
Indirectly, if I may, it raises the question of terms of service, so and kind of GDPR related issues. If that individual, albeit they are a child, they still have some agency over their data, or what they have is their own data. But as a side related issue, which we obviously haven't got time to go into, but the terms of service themselves are difficult for individuals to access. They, and they are in some ways rendered meaningless because they are very inconvenient. They're very hidden. So if you were to ask for it to be commonplace for everybody to make a decision, would they want that? Would they want that information available to their family in the event of their death? That would just be under a long list of terms of service, which currently are quite difficult to navigate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a point I'm sure in terms of that the committee will return to. We'll have to leave it there, but I do just want to thank you, Dr. Karen Middleton, and thank you, Phil Smith. We found your evidence very informative and enlightening, and thank you for spending the time with us this morning. Order. Order, and welcome to this, the second panel in the SEC Committee's session this morning into social media algorithms and harmful content. And we will be looking now at content moderation and online safety. And I'd like to welcome our two witnesses. And I'm going to start with a question to Lyric Jane, and to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, and then Dr. Urliani Abdul Rahman, you can introduce yourself later. So this committee is particularly sort of looking at the aftermath of the causes and aftermath of the riots over the summer, and as we know, that was started or it's fueled, as Ofcom has said, that there was a clear connection between online activity and the violent disorder on the streets. And the ways in which social media were implicated included a post on LinkedIn claiming the alleged attacker was a migrant was viewed more than 2 million times, despite being taken down. And an ex-user shared the false claim of the attacker's name. And that was used as part of TikTok's other search for feature, so promoting it across TikTok. So my question to you, Lyric Jane, is: do social media platforms have adequate measures to deal with misleading and harmful content in times of crisis?
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone here for the opportunity to provide evidence. Lyric, I'm the founder and CEO of Logically. We're an artificial intelligence company very much founded to build technologies to identify information operations in the online landscape, and we've been working with government and platforms across the last 4 or 5 years to do exactly that. We were quite active last year amidst the events in Southport, and I think there's a number of things to take into account when looking at how effective platforms' measures were. I think the first point to state is when speaking about the very large platforms, that's often where typical discussions focus a lot of the debate on what they should be doing. But what we saw was there was a lot of activity on not necessarily the very large online platforms, but emerging large platforms. And really there's a very significant difference between the measures and capabilities that very large platforms have and even large platforms have. And the distinction between the two of these could be, platforms with tens of millions of users, but still platforms with millions of users. And there's a very, very significant gulf in capability between what those two sets of platforms can do.
Could you name some of those platforms as examples?
Sort of platforms that typically haven't been in the VLOPS category would include Telegram. I think they've recently been reclassified into the VLOPS category, but we do see a lot of the activity related to Southport did originate on Telegram, particularly foreign interference. There was very significant foreign interference on Telegram as well as X. And I think historically, to really answer this question, it's worth considering how this space and capabilities have evolved over the last 5 years, or even kind of 8 years, if we're taking a longer view. Typically, the measures that platforms have in place to tackle misinformation have been very distinct and largely separated from how they counter disinformation or attack content likely to incite violence, etc. And the way in which those two programs work, even in the very large platforms such as Meta, TikTok, are largely quite disconnected. To the point where they've got very separate programs. The teams have very limited collaboration, and there's very little collaboration even between platforms when these instances do flare up. I think one thing to also note is the change in how, especially the foreign element of this is operated over the last few years. If we zoom back to 2016 and the Russian information operations in particular that operated back then, the modus operandi was content farms. It was how do we initiate messaging in a number of countries to achieve whatever the objectives of the Russian government were. Since 2020, that's had a pretty significant shift. They no longer, or very rarely, I should say, originate new messaging. They amplify messaging that already exists within domestic communities. and that makes it very hard to know where a foreign influence operation starts, where organic domestic participation around it begins, and equally where kind of enforcement around accounts, content that have been engaging in that campaign, what that should look like and how it should be different for domestic accounts versus foreign accounts. So that's very much one of the kind of underlying challenges that we saw in Southport. And finally, there was also a lot of amplification synthetically for what we saw. I think everyone can agree that we should have stringent freedom of expression protections for the population of the UK and citizens of the UK. However, our viewers, bots should not enjoy that privilege, and it was certainly the case on X that bots did play a pretty significant role in amplifying some of that activity.
So, what do you think government should do to address the challenges that you've outlined and the deep concerns that you've outlined, and particularly, actually, if you can respond to this, are there, in terms of our sort of domestic security, you're saying the platforms don't have adequate measures. I think that's what you're saying. Do we have adequate powers to address? Does the government and our security services have adequate powers to address that?
I'd say it's somewhat unclear at this stage, because the OSA wasn't in full force as of last year. The Disinformation Committee of Ofcom the advisory board is still being set up. So I think it still remains to be seen how a lot of these measures will be effective. And I think there's great hope that existing legislation would help reduce the impact of such activity in the future. But I think the ground perhaps less covered through government intervention and action at the moment is really looking at proactive monitoring. The legislation does make some note on what government's currently doing to proactively monitor for these incidents, and the requirements it places on platforms to proactively monitor for these incidents. But it's not platforms are currently motivated to do so on a periodic basis, on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, based on whatever the country's reporting requirements are. It isn't particularly motivated based on risk. It's not motivated based on risk that day, that hour, that week, on public safety, public health, national security. And I think there could be a more risk-based approach to intervention, and the approach with which we assess platforms on how effective their measures are. And on the government front, I think the biggest thing in the Southport, particularly in that case, that would have helped is probably just more disclosure, more information. The vacuum of information in the initial hours really didn't help, and if both through kind of local policing, but also through selective declassification of intelligence, if there could have been early sharing of information out in the public domain, that perhaps could have been an effective intervention by different parts of government.
I'm not only talking about effective intervention at that point, but government powers and regulation. You said that the Online Safety Act, we look to that to provide more powers, but the social media companies told us that they would have not done anything differently had the Online Safety Act been in force. Can I ask you, did we know which messages Russia was amplifying at that time, and did we have the powers to address it?
I think there was great suspicion at that time, and I think this remains one of the challenges in terms of attributing foreign interference. It's quite simple to do so retrospectively, after we have all the fingerprints and we can see how campaigns evolved, etc. But doing so in real time as these campaigns are underway online, we didn't have even a lot of similar capabilities operating in government. It took a few hours before we were able to make that determination. And by that point in time, the narrative was already out of control. And really what I'd kind of call for from a capability perspective is kind of more investment, kind of real-time capability in identifying these things on an hourly, minutely basis, as opposed to moving with the timescales of days in mind.
I wanted to talk about your point, these anonymised sources, whether they be agents of another country or people using the anonymity profiles. Do you think this is something the government should look at in terms of ensuring that profiles, that there's a capability to know exactly who owns who is running what profiles. It may be linked to the government's efforts around digital identity.
I think it's a challenging intervention, because we do, I think, want the ability for people to speak anonymously and freely online, and adding additional barriers to that could potentially demotivate people, say whistleblowers and others, from making such public disclosures. So I think, in principle, such interventions would help, but I think the balance between that and people's ability to express things freely, even with they might be under certain threats, etc., needs to be considered whilst framing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alok Jain. Let me come to you now, Dr. Uliani Abdulrahman. So Meta told the committee that safety is their number one priority, whilst TikTok labelled safety their North Star since day one. Do you agree with these claims?
Yes, I actually read through the testimony from the previous session, and I would like to restrict my comments to X and Meta. So I was.
Could you introduce yourself first?
Oh, sorry. Is it?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Dr. Uliani Abdulrahman. I'm a senior fellow at Georgetown, and I consider myself a scholar practitioner. I'd like to restrict my comments to Meta and X. After Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, I was at the time on the Twitter Trust and Safety Council.
Right.
I resigned in protest against the meteoric rise in hate speech after a month in. And also following Mark Zuckerberg's announcements in January this year, I don't believe that the tech billionaires focus on safety as the number one priority. Just want to give a quick overview in the last 2 years in terms of content moderation and developments on online safety. So from November 2022, is it too far?
Mic, I think. Yes, great.
Oh, sorry. Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah. So from November 2022 until November 2023, Meta, X, and YouTube deprioritized content moderation and also roll back policies regarding that would dampen hate and harassment, disinformation and misinformation on their platforms. In total, they removed more than 40,000 workers that were working on trust and safety and platform integrity. So I'm not going to zoom in on X because that's where I was at. These cuts reflected the company's priorities and values. So with Musk, he fired more than 7,000 people, which comprised 82% of the workforce. It had serious impact on the core capabilities of the platform. So there was huge rise in hate speech and disinformation. There was a study by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue that showed that the English language anti-Semitic tweets more than doubled in the period following the takeover. Right. I also just want to highlight here that whatever Musk does is almost like, if you will, a playbook for the other platform companies. Mm-hmm. So in November 2022, he reinstated the then former US President Donald Trump's account. Mm-hmm. By doing so, he basically normalized, and by not taking such actors into account, their incendiary speech, he was also privileging such speech. Mm-hmm. In January 2023, Meta followed suit, and then in March 2023, YouTube. X also, in the same period, reinstated previously suspended accounts. So these belong to white supremacists, misogynists, and also those who promote hate speech. Unfortunately, one of them was Tommy Robinson, full name, Stephen Yaxley Lennon. So that's just on the platforms and capabilities. I want to give two examples regarding safety on these platforms. One is Meta, and it's often been cited, but I think it bears repeating, Myanmar. In 2021, Amnesty International did an investigation that found that Facebook substantially contributed to the atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya. From 2013 to 2017, there were multiple calls from civil society calling to the failures of Meta in this country. Meta chose not to heed those warnings. That's Meta. For X, in the first week following the Israel-Hamas war, there was an analysis by NewsGuard. It's an actor in trust and safety. And they found that X had become a super spreader of misinformation regarding this conflict. So this was boosted mainly by those with the blue ticks, the blue check marks, it's now called legacy period. I mean, in those days it was more to authenticate a user, but these days you can just buy it, as you all know. These users on X account for 74% of the most viral falsehoods relating to the conflict. In the first week alone, there were 1.3 million engagements with this post and more than 100 million views in that first 1 week. And what NewsCut found was that the false narratives tend to go viral first on X and then migrated to other platforms, including TikTok or Instagram. So whether it's safe, I disagree. And we can also go further into details, including what Fernandez had mentioned about the Global Transparency Report, because I have more numbers on that as well.
Thank you very much for that contribution. And you emphasize the consequences of the spread of misinformation in the past and abroad. And specifically on the Rohingya massacres, has Meta, in your view, been held to account for that in any sense?
No, they have not. And actually, there has been there's an ongoing legal suit by defendants in this space, and Meta has chosen not to respond, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. Paul, did you want to come here?
Thanks for that, Dr. Rom. I just wanted to check something that X has told us, which is that they now, under their new rules, they say they restrict the reach of any posts which will contradict their own alleged rules on violent speech and harassment and abuse. They restrict the reach, but they say they don't remove it. Now, is that a distinction that's not worth the candle? In other words, is there any point in them having rules at all if they don't remove content? Or is it justifiable in any way for them to say they restrict the reach of that content?
I think it's really interesting because a lot of the oral proceedings that I've gone through in January and February is focused on content, and that really protects the companies in the way that is Section 230 U.S. Communications Decency Act. And so for me, I think it's important to focus also on the actors and the behaviors. Mm-hmm. I want to highlight the work of Professor Camille Francois from Columbia University, and she has highlighted the ABC framework on viral deception. So she calls it 3 vectors: A for actors, B for behaviors, and C for content. And so long as you talk about content, the platforms can always say, Section 230 doesn't apply to us. Different jurisdiction OSA, I'm not an expert on it, but there's ways that we can improve on it under OSA. I think it's important to also understand that amplifiers, in this case, highly networked accounts, do play a very significant role. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what is happening is, for example, Tommy Robinson says certain things on different platforms. These are amplified by what I call swarmers, people who are contributing to the swarm. And we talked earlier about identity of these people. They don't have the identity. They're trying to be anonymous. But the amplifiers play a very big role in how things get inflamed. So I think that an important thing that we need to look here is the role of such actors. And in the particular case of Musk, because he owns the platform, he has an outsized influence in what happens. For example, with the Gaza, the war, a study done by University of Washington has shown that the top 7 influencers in terms of disinformation in the period of October 2023, Musk engaged with at least 6 of the 7 top propagating of such disinformation. Because he did so, these took off. So again, like some of these things, I think we need to actually have a better understanding of what it means, what amplifiers to get involved, and then what does that mean when these, I call it a swarm, when the swarms take off. Yeah. How does it impact what happens in terms of offline violence?
Is there any evidence that X's claim that they're restricting the reach of this content is actually happening? Is there any evidence that they are restricting?
I think it's very hard to say because the access to the API is prohibitively expensive. One of the things I think the OSA can do would be to have a mandatory access, data access for researchers, right. To the kind of regime that it was before, where we were able to actually say, okay, this is what happens, and then we can check on what you're saying, because a lot of this right now is really self-reporting. They're saying we're doing this, and we can't really track unless we have that high-level access. So I can't really comment, no.
Just thank you very much for that, Paul. You highlighted there the role of Elon Musk in amplifying misinformation during the early days of the Gaza conflict. Are you aware of any way in which that misinformation spread or his actions are being held to account?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Can I ask another example? And I won't read the tweets, but when Tommy Robinson was readmitted to X, there was a particular application by Elon Musk in his, particularly the documentary he's currently in prison for in my constituency, so I get a lot of the swarm for that. But literally it would have detracted from the prosecution of people who were actually going on trial for grooming gangs. And that is actually what he's in prison for, to make sure that so that he couldn't do that. Given that it involves a legal case, and given that Elon Musk was amplifying those messages which could have led to the breakdown of the trial of these child groomers, which would have been appalling, do you think the platform, the individuals, should be held account? And what would the legal framework need to look like in order to do that?
I think it's right now as a whole, it's currently insufficient, because if you look at hateful conduct and abuse and harassment, some of these same actors are going against the terms of services. It's quite clear, it's quite simple. But if you have an amplifier who's also an owner of a platform, and they are doing certain things where it's actually hateful conduct and or amplifying harassment, I don't think the current legal regime as it stands in the US would actually protect any of the users. What I wanted to discuss today, I don't know whether you had a copy of my note that I sent. So this is basically a new way of, it's not a new way. We all know about dogpiling and brigading, but shockingly, it has not, to my knowledge, been quantified before. And so when I quantified what happened, so basically you have someone who's highly networked, an amplifier. If he puts you in front of a new audience, so for example, Member of Parliament Emily Darlington, you may be a target. He puts you in front of a new audience, suddenly you have a sudden jump, right? So you're just doing your normal work, you tweet about something, and then he doesn't like your tweet, he just takes it up and he puts it there in front of a new audience, and you suddenly have a sudden jump on this particular tweet, so stochastic increase. So all you need to see is not so much what's in the content of what I call the swarm, because you see the sudden rise. It's the pattern. When somebody like him posts and you see the jump, that's all you need to know for a platform. You see this happens, amplifier posts, swarm happens, swarm ensues. So what we can actually ask the social media platforms to do is to establish thresholds for that form of harassment. I call it indirect swarming because you catalyze a swarm. Most of them are against you, but you have followers who will try and support you. But in doing so, they still contribute to the swarm, right? So it's inevitable. And so for me, in my case, I received death threats and doxing threats. They were quite smart about it. They didn't say, want to see you killed, but they said in graphic ways how they want to see me die. And so I couldn't take it to the FBI, but I had to keep checking my timeline in order to make sure there was no imminent death threats. For the other two women who were alongside me, it was too much for them. But I was the one that was checking our timeline 5 times at least, in that moment. So the kind of jump that I'm talking about here, in our case, was 200 tweets every minute over a 24-hour period. And so that, for social media companies, they know that it's a sudden jump that is not typical of what was happening before. They can establish those thresholds. And Ofcom can have, for example, monthly, quarterly assessments with these companies to see what that looks like in terms of establishing thresholds and levels. And what's most important here, the OSA is trying to establish more user controls, giving agency back to the user. With this approach, if companies allow us to have a button that says, I'm being mass harassed, I'm being dogpiled, or whatever it is, you press the button, you stop all engagement. Because under Twitter right now, in my case at the time, I'm off it, you can only block 5 people at a time. And that's an impossibility. And they can still like it and retweet it, which still adds to the algorithm, which still adds to your visibility, which still allows virality to continue. So a lot of the work we've been talking about so far in January and February is on content. We need to talk about the speed, the amplification, the volume, and how it's done in terms of the posts and engagement. That's what's really pertinent. The companies know that. They're not going to tell you about it.
Right. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I think, Adam, in fact, you're coming in on this very point.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. In fact, I thank you very much, Ariane, for your explanation of dogpiling and that whole process. You know, I know from my own social media, every time I post about education policy specifically, I have one or two people who will take that post, share it in a group, and I will repeatedly get dogpiled by the same group of individuals who specifically oppose our particular education policy. So I thank you for very much for that. You talk about how you might be able to resolve some of those issues by including a "I'm being dogpiled" button. This is the sort of safety by design methodology we heard on our previous panel from Dr. Karen Middleton about safety by design. I was going to ask if you think that it's enough to rely on content moderation. I think you've made pretty clear it probably isn't. But could you elaborate on some of those thoughts about implementing safety by design and what that might look like in practice?
I think it's a really great question. I think a lot of the focus in terms of the debate in society, just in general, has been focused on the supply side. And the narrative has been led by the big tech company themselves. They co-opt the language. They use language like empowering and democracy in order to kind of, deprioritize content moderation and are pushing the onus of the burden onto us. So, for example, crowdsourcing, community notes is crowdsourcing. And so for me, that's the wrong approach. This inquiry is a timely reminder of what is important. So it's not just about content moderation per se as a standalone thing. We need to also interrogate critically the entire system. So not just content moderation, but what the platform was set up for, what problem it was meant to solve, what communities they're fostering online, the norms that they are doing, the practices as well, and whether they're inadvertently, or maybe even not inadvertently, entrenching online harms by the structure that they have built. So I think the more pertinent question is really, what do we want as users? And to your question, I like that very much because we know this. The people who have been, for example, my field of expertise is on network harassment. That means somebody who's an amplifier puts you to a new audience and you get all this harass. It's disproportionately affecting people of color, women, people from historically marginalized communities. There's just no way around it. This is the truth. And so are their voices being included when we talk about, say, safety by design? It's not the case. I mean, do we have stakeholder engagement, but are they being significantly included when you talk about processes and outcomes? Musk, again, has led the playbook in this regard because he basically got rid of the council. I left the council, then he fired them, the rest who remained 4 days later. Other companies followed suit because they see that it can be done. And so trans safety isn't a thing anymore. A lot of it's been outsourced. So we need to understand what does it mean when that capability is not there anymore. So, for example, I just want to highlight a UNESCO report from 2023, which I find quite disturbing. It's on tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And what they're arguing is that it's not just about online harassment, but it's really a testbed for new and novel forms of emerging harms. That's the problem with technology. If we talk about legislation, we're always playing catch-up. But people who are doing this trolling or doing this kind of work, they know what they're doing. And they're using us, people of color, women, as a testbed before this form of harm goes out to the mainstream. So it's actually quite dangerous. And so for me, I just want to ask you, what was the question again?
How did you think that you could implement these? What sort of safety by design protocols might be able to implement in practice? What could they do?
Yeah, I think meaningful engagement. So basically, it's not just a tick and a box, and then it has to be actually sitting at the table and then co-creating something together. I don't think currently technology, and I'm saying about the big tech, the ethos stands because it's really moving fast and breaking things. If we really were talking about safety by design, it's slow and it's deliberate. It's talking about the things I just mentioned about just now, where we have a button which goes against the business principles, right? Because you want more engagement. You want more toxic engagement, to be more precise. And so if I switch it off, that will impact the business models. Francis Haugen has said very clearly, because there were ways to actually look at things that were not based on content, but it would basically turn it down by a few percentage points. Facebook was reluctant to do it. They had very clear things where in 2019, they were trying to figure out the algorithms. This is from the Facebook files. a series of stories that was published in the Wall Street Journal, and it was released based on the leaked documents by Francis Haugen. Even as far back as 2019, Facebook was really worried about the algorithm and what it could mean. It wasn't until January 6, 2021 that they realized that they had to change the way the algorithm was doing because it was causing more harms. And we had talked here about inauthentic coordinated behavior, so like bots and state actors. Facebook was really looking at the time too at authentic actors, people like, the Patriot Party, all these things. And they knew they had no policy around it. And so when Meta says they had all these announcements and they were looking to say they will not take proactive action on certain forms of harms, what does it mean? Does this mean this form of harm? Does it mean incitement to violence? Which bit? I'm not clear.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's incredibly clear. Two final questions from me. Firstly, and I think you've answered this already, but just to clarify, do you think it would be technically possible to implement these types of changes that we're talking about into these platforms? And then if we assume that it's against the business interests of the companies to implement these kind of tools, how can we force them to do it?
I think if we focus on, say, threshold ratios and making it about the user, is user-centered, right? And so if you say, okay, we have, for example, this form of new indirect swarming where its threshold levels are like this, and I presented this work at the Stanford Trust Safety Conference, at TrustCon, at the regional meeting as well as the summit. It really resonates with engineers because they think it's immediately doable. And it's also a user tool that can be done to prevent virality. So usually we think in industry it could be 3 hours, could be quicker or longer, but it stops it from taking off. And so that's really important because it's user-centered. It's compliance Section 230 of the U.S. Comms Decency Act. It preserves the First Amendment right to free speech because the user decides. It doesn't matter whether it's bipartisan or whatever it is. It's just virality. And if it's negative virality of any form, the user decides, and that's it. It's completely doable. I've spoken to people in big tech for the insight, and they think it can be done.
So how do we get these companies, if we work under the assumption that to implement these kind of controls would inherently reduce engagement with the platforms, how do we tell them they have to do this?
It's like the tobacco industry or any other industries in the past. I think we need to really have a public health lens on big tech. Right now, it's a bit like the Wild Wild West. They will disavow this, but I think it's true because we kind of let them dictate the narratives on how it can be done when actually there are ways around this and there's ways to do it. And so for me, let's take a public health lens approach because we're always talking about the intention of the harasser, the intention of the perpetrator, which is hard to adjudicate. And so if we talk about, say, the impact on society, the impact on targets and victims, that's clearer. So it's a bit like putting on a seatbelt and going out to drive. Your intention wasn't to drive over somebody, but you did, and the person died. And so we're talking about what happened to that person, and that's a very simple thing. Seatbelts and smoking, they are precedents for this. We need to do the same in this industry.
I think, thank you very much. We know that the Online Safety Act gives Ofcom the ability to look at companies' platforms' algorithms. And it also gives platforms the duty to mitigate certain risks. We're not clear whether misinformation is one of them. Yeah. But between that duty and that ability, there would certainly be the opportunity to have transparency on whether or not these mitigations, these dialed-down controls are in place. And that's something we can certainly raise with Ofcom when they come to see us. Thank you so much for that. I think now I'm going to ask Paul to come in.
Again, to you, Dr. Rahman. We had the representative of X and of Meta before us the other week, and they were softly spoken, but what they said was still shocking.
Yes.
When I put to them in particular the leaked guidance about Meta,
yes.
Particularly the fact that now statements that could be allowed are black people are more violent than whites, Jews are more flat out greedier than Christians. The response from Mr. Yu was, some conversations, while challenging, should have a space to be discussed. Now, you used to sit on Twitter's effectively regulatory arm of this safety issue. How dangerous a shift has that been?
I think it's a very big shift. And I also just want to mention here, because Meta submitted a written evidence for this inquiry on 18 December 2024. And just 20 days later, Mark Zuckerberg did a complete turnaround and said that he doesn't want to do proactive enforcement of certain forms of harmful content. So what you're alluding to. I just find it really shocking because it doesn't make the platform doesn't make it safe for anyone. Mm-hmm. And again, we need clarity on what that means because it's not clear at all what will happen now. For example, when you talk about community notes, and I can talk about what it means in terms of efficacy, it's not efficacious at all. I just worry about users and how we can make sure that we protect users' safety.
And what's clear is that the representative of X actually said that he felt that X was now safer under Elon Musk.
Okay,
what
so
was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I really want to prepare for this question. Yes, it's not safe at all. I actually had a look at a global transparency report that he mentioned. This was for the period of the second half of the first half of 2024. Mm-hmm. Marks the first time that X has published such a report under the new regime under Elon Musk. And the previous such report was for the second half of 2021. And that one, I just want to mention the numbers. For 2021, there were 11.6 million accounts that were flagged for violations, of which there were 4.3 million accounts that were acted upon. And then 1.3 million were suspended. So again, the numbers. In 2021, 11.6 million accounts were flagged, of which 1.3 million were suspended. In this latest report that Fernandez mentioned, there were over 224 million reports and of accounts and individual content. And yet, despite the surge, despite the huge rise, the number of suspensions only rose to 5.3 million. Mm-hmm. 24, 5.3. Again, this is comparing apples and oranges, right? Because Elon Musk had done a whole change in policy shifts. He's rolled back on hate speech. He allowed misgendering on the platform. But let's talk about hateful conduct. So in 2021, hateful conduct, there was action taken against 1 million accounts for posting hateful material. In this latest report, there were only 2,361 accounts that were addressed for hateful conduct. How many reports were there for hateful conduct alone? 66.9 million. So the numbers of themselves, even if you talk about, say, takedown rates, is shocking. I will give you more numbers now. I looked at.
Sorry, I think we need to move on. I appreciate it, but maybe you could write.
In terms of what we're interested in is what can one of the things we're interested in is what can the UK government do to combat this. I mean, is there anything extra under the Online Safety Act that we should be looking at as a government and as a parliament to stem that surge, as you call it, in hate?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the OSA, but I think one of the things that's not mandatory right now is data access. I think that would be a really good way to look and to see what access is actually saying, because a lot of it's really, I think we said this in the previous sessions, marking their own homework. If we have the access to the data, it's much easier then to do some of the things like I mentioned, even the threshold ratios. We can have case studies. We can show the longitudinal work in terms of even what access is saying about safety or not, right? So a lot of these things can be proven and done by academic researchers themselves, but really need data access, and that would change a lot of things.
So maybe legislate to force them to be more transparent.
That's right.
I think there are options there that we need to look into. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul Rahman. I think Lyric Jane has not spoken for a little while, but I know Lauren has a question for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have a question for you. So what do you think are the most effective ways of preventing the spread of misleading information? Is it kind of independent third-party checker? Is it a crowdsourcing models? Is it a combination? What do you think we need to be doing to stop the spread of misleading information?
I think there's been a lot of learnings here over the last 6-7 years since Meta initially rolled out its 3PFC program. At the moment, the approach in vogue seems to be community notes, and there are some really good aspects about community notes. in terms of how more people can participate, how, through crowdsourcing, people with greater local context or subject matter expertise may be able to contribute to assessments, and it's certainly a lot more economical. And particularly speaking on kind of the X implementation of community notes, it actually promotes conflict in a good way, conflict of ideas. So there's certainly some good elements to community notes, but really what's somewhat unsatisfying about community notes from a user experience perspective, but also from a safety perspective, is they don't always lead to a definitive conclusion, and they're not always timely. And really, if we look at the work that 120 odd accredited fact-checking organizations around the world have done as part of Meta's program or TikTok's program, and full disclosure, we happen to be part of those programs. It's been work that's been really powerful in helping downrank certain types of harmful content. However, a lot of this has not had the sufficient level of technology support to really be motivated towards risk. So over the last, say, 6, 7, 8 years, while these programs have been operational, a lot of the fact checks, a lot of fact checks were really impactful. A lot of the fact checks that were conducted by organizations were really on quite a few frivolous topics. They were on quite a few kind of quite repetitive in some cases. So looking at it from a platform's perspective, there's certainly room for innovation and change. And what we advocate for is really a hybrid approach. When it comes to the most risky pieces of communication and misleading content that could have the most significant implications in terms of public health, public safety, national security, we need to take a risk-weighted approach where those types of narratives, those types of misleading content are prioritized through feeds for professionals who are accredited to really assess, whereas kind of the wide swath of online communications, something like a community note style intervention might be helpful. So, and there's been even in the last 2 months, despite some of the kind of challenging news from platforms and their shifts in policies, there's been some appetite from them to take on such approaches. But I think what would help, perhaps in the UK context, is mandating platforms to have something like a 3PFC program. Something like Europe does currently right now. Under the DSA, platforms are required to report on whether they have any third-party fact-checking programs where actual professionals are used to assess for misinformation risk, etc. And a similar approach in the UK would be quite welcome. We know there's a Meta's, we work with them, we continue to work with them through this year, but it appears the Community Notes program will be rolled out globally on Meta and other platforms sometime next year, and it would be helpful that the UK, if the UK legislation were in a place where platforms are mandated to do something in this space, and at the moment that's a gap. They are mandated to do something in Europe, but not necessarily in the UK.
So you kind of, there's a bit of both that you're promoting there. I mean, the third party kind of professional, where you say about mental health, public health, national security, those sorts of things. I mean, given the huge numbers of posts that there are in different community groups on the scrolling, I mean, it's going to cost a lot, isn't it, for those companies to do that? Do you think that they may not wish to do it because of those reasons?
I think there's definitely economic reasons not to do so, which is why I think prioritization here is really important. If you look at a platform like Meta, I believe they invest something like 40-50 million a year specifically on their 3PFC program, which is significant, but not that significant when you consider their total trust and safety budget is around 2 billion. So it isn't a category that a lot of investment goes towards, and Meta is the leading example of investment here. I think through technology and through kind of a lot of the progress that's been made in AI, there can be a lot more efficiency that's driven into the expert verification process. And really the challenge over the last 6, 7, 8 years since these programs have been alive has been that challenge of how do we get to the stuff that's most harmful in a timely manner. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the area where technology can make the greatest contribution to get a greater impact and from the work the fact checkers are doing, and in turn platforms therefore get a bigger bang for their buck for anything they're investing in the space.
I suppose just on that point about the most harmful and you could go to the legal, the most harmful, as we've kind of mentioned in this room, it's the coupling of either advertisement alongside harmful messages to the wrong person or to a vulnerable person. It's not necessary. How do you define harmful? Because that harmful over a number of weeks, months could then be incredibly harmful. But if you look at the track, it may not be harmful to another person. So how do we really define and pin down what harmful is?
I think there's currently a cybersecurity framework in place that the NTSE put out for cyber risks. Yeah. I think we could probably follow a similar approach when it comes to information operations, misleading content, and other types of harms online, where there could be super concentrated risk around one individual, which platforms are required to act on, but also these kind of societal risks, which largely go unattended to at the moment, where there's a little bit of harm across millions of people.
I think, if I understand you correctly, you're setting out a sort of prioritization of harmful content so that could be directed towards fact checkers, and that prioritization would take place in some sort of other algorithm. And I suppose what Lauren's question is, who defines what those are? Because is there a tension here? There's two questions here. Is it technically feasible? And you seem to think that it is, and I would value Dr. Abdul Rahman's consideration whether it's technically feasible to have some sort of big AI algorithm looking at everybody's posts and deciding what is or is not a priority when it comes to harm. But isn't the question of who decides what is harm, therefore, is also a question of free speech? And should the government be deciding what is harm there?
I think that's a really challenging question, because I think we work with a number of allied governments around the world, and the UK government tends to be the one that's probably least prescriptive, and for good reason, exactly because of that tension. I think there's probably room to be slightly more prescriptive than we are right now in terms of what that prioritization should look like. And the priority isn't necessarily between national security versus public safety. The prioritization could be based on weighing what potential harms are, and you could weigh some of these harms equally, the likelihood of those harms occurring, the capability of any threat actor in actually being able to follow on and conduct offline harm, etc., as a result of it. But I'd also echo Dr. Rahman's points here around the ABC framework. It's very rarely just about the content. It's about how these kind of atoms and molecules of discourse, as we call them, across content, accounts, activity individually may impact people, or in aggregate shape narratives, shape communities, and coordinate behavior online. To the point of kind of efficacy on these capabilities, actually this is something that we've been championing with platforms as well as the fact-checking community since last June. There was the International Fact-Checking Networks Conference. We actually built something to do exactly that, and there's around 30 accredited organizations who've been using that platform since then. But that's certainly had a bit of a headwind in the last couple of months, given some announcements from platforms.
Thank you very much, Rick Jane. And Dr. Abdul Rahman, can you just comment on the feasibility of technically of identifying high-risk content?
I think it really should be a hybrid approach, and I think we need to also think about what kind of harm. So, for example, if we're talking about network harassment, I think in the past when we're talking about brigading or posts, there's threshold levels that I was told Meta was looking at Facebook. So, for example, if a post has more than 30 comments, it goes up to a human moderator to look at. This is around 2019, and I think that has changed because of recent developments. So I think it really depends on what harm it is, how we actually define the harm. And I think with this approach, it should be a societal approach. It can't be led by big tech. It needs to be in a room like this where the governments, civil society, and tech themselves sit together and do it. It cannot be a tech-led endeavor in that way.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. John, did you want to come in here on this bit, and then we'll move on?
I just wanted to follow up an earlier question that Emily addressed to Lyric, but I want to address to you, Dr. Abdul Rahman. we've talked about the responsibility of the platforms. We've talked about the responsibility of the advertisers in the previous session. I'm really interested in the point around actually the responsibility of the users and the ability for, for example, can a bot be entitled to free speech? Why are the social media companies not taking more action to close down bots that have has to rate? Why are they allowing them to operate? And is there not the reason for a lot of the harmful content and its amplification? Because, to take Dr. Sullivan's point, that in effect social media has become the Wild West, though there is no personal responsibility. And is there more we should be doing as a government in the UK in that space?
Yes, completely. I'm not an expert when it comes to inauthentic behavior, so this is regarding bots. But what my research was, I'm looking at still, would be authentic actors. So again, like I said, the Toby Robinsons of this world, the Elon Musks of this world, those actors are not being regulated right now. And I think that's a more pertinent question with regard to, say, the support rights than, say, bots. Bots, there are methods around it. I mean, there's math, it can be gamed, like how we measure whether this thing is coming online this time, and then you can find out whether it's a bot or not, or things like that. The more complicated question really is about authentic actors and what it means. Because it's not just simply he posts and then this is happening. That's one part of the quantitative method. But it's also the qualitative aspect of it, right? The joy, the effervescence of being part of the swarm. People take part in it, and there's this thing about the false communications aspect of the OSA, which I find very intriguing, because then how do you also attribute, say, blame when it comes to a swarm or somebody who takes part in a swarm? And I say, no, we can't do that. We can actually maybe attribute blame to the amplifier, because he or she knowingly does it, because this is the problem with community notes, for example. This has been a study, and I can send it on to you guys, by in the Queen's University of Technology, where they looked at it as a totality, community notes in X, the X structure. It's not enough, because when they looked at it, if you look at disinformation, it's always inflected with humor. And that's where community notes on Twitter, on X, fails, because it becomes a reductive binary approach of a yes and no, when actually humor can be weaponized, and we all know that. And so then there's always this possible deniability the amplifiers exercise, right? And so then you can't do intent. So again, that's one part of it, but I think a lot of focus needs to be on the targets. There's very shockingly very few studies where you actually foreground the target's perspective. Mine was one of them, where I actually did an MA perspective to look at what happened to me when I resigned and got all that harassment. Most of the time, we are looking at harassers. So we also look at the target's perspective and what can be done, what can be improved. We also help to hold companies accountable for what harms that they're doing on their platforms.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Rahman, for sharing your experience. We are running out of time. I have one particular question I want to ask to you before we move on to the Online Safety Act and Emily. But the question I want to ask to you regards specifically Meta Oversight Board, who did not agree to attend today's session. When requested. That was obviously a disappointment to us. Can you briefly just say what your view is of the Meta Oversight Board and other independent oversight boards? Can they truly be independent?
I'm not an expert on the oversight board, but I can tell you more about how we've done it. We did it at the Twitter Trust and Safety Council. This is quite laughable, but after 6 years, this is all I got. So there's no compensation, and I think it's important to have that complete independence, and that's what we were trying to do under Jack Dorsey. The Musk was a completely different kettle of fish, and I think that's what's really important. Having said that, again, like I said before, Elon Musk sets the playbook in terms of how things are happening. And even if we say, okay, it's important to have an independent advisory board, blah, 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 they will see, companies can just see it as an add-on. The ethos still remains to move fast and break things. If we are really talking about safety by design, they need to move slow and be deliberate. They need to include people who have been harassed, have gone through online harassment, and be involved in the very start when they create a product, not by the way process. So I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. And having, say, a mandatory requirement to have this board or whatever it is, it will be an add-on that doesn't actually help the process.
Thank you very much. Now, Emily, we're going to come to the Online Safety Act and whether that is the solution to some of the challenges we've heard.
Yes. So I have a couple of questions in this area. I think that the first question I just want to ask, which is kind of a culmination of where we've gotten to, is there a room for, this is the Science and Innovation and Technology Committee. We firmly believe in science.
Yes.
So is there still room for scientific fact online, particularly when it's contrasted with these ideas of free speech, when the statements Paul read out earlier clearly have no basis in scientific fact? Where does scientific fact actually sit within, I appreciate we're focusing on content here, but where does scientific fact actually sit within content moderation, and where does it, what is the role for enforcement of that?
It's a very difficult question. I come from the US. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I think you know the conflagration that's happening there. Yeah. For example, I just want to say, because we're talking about science, and I come from the field of public health and development, if you put in a grant right now to National Institute of Health and you mention women, you'll be disqualified. Yep. There's many words that's now been banned, and I will use the word ban. It's social justice, racial justice, equity, diversity, LGBTQIA, women, indigenous community, Native American. So there's a complete backlash about science. And for me, sometimes when we talk about labeling and fact-checking, it's almost like we're sitting in a room and we are on our own, because the rest of the world, or the bigger, there's a complete backlash in these intellectual ideas, and there's a complete erosion of trust in institutions. So for me, it's also like a question of like, how do we counter that in a way that's effective? Because they're doing it really well. For example, what's happening in politics in the US, and that also has a collusion with tech there, and I will say that, is that it's really performative. So a lot of what's happening, say, in political fora is to play to a particular crowd and audience. And you see that they're using very simple language. Yeah. We need to do the same if we are progressive and liberal, and how do we do that effectively? I don't know what the answer is. I would say maybe storytelling. Maybe not so much science as science per se. In COVID, in the field of global health where I come from, it's bridge builders. So not so much that your doctor or GP telling a patient on how to take a vaccine. It's a priest or it's a family friend. And those are the bridge builders during COVID that we found was effective in Black communities during COVID. But yeah, whether science plays a role, I
think for this committee, it's something that's particularly prescient, and where we are watching what's happening in the US very carefully, particularly around misinformation around vaccines or prenatal care or many other medical issues with very, very serious consequences, real life consequences to young people, women, and everyone really. So it leads to a really important question for this committee, and one that's been a bit of an elephant in the room throughout our inquiry, which is without US backing, or in fact seeing very active people, including Elon Musk, attack us for being the most regressive on free speech, and J.D. Vance saying that free speech was the biggest threat to Europe at the moment. Can the UK really address any of these social media issues and social media platforms without the US backing? Can we act alone in this place and be effective?
I think we can build upon what's been done in DSA, and also add on by working on this thing that I call the vectors, which is the actors and the behaviors. Meta, for example, has been doing it up to this point in time. So it's not a new thing for some of these actors that we're talking about. They are familiar with the discussion. And I think when you talk about actors and behaviors, it is protective of the First Amendment, and also it's compliant Section 230, because that's about content. Once you talk about actors and sequencing and patterns, very different thing. And you can actually make those companies figure out the thresholds. And if they don't, making sure that there's a mandatory data access, so we researchers can come in and do that.
Right.
Just to build on that point, I think we do quite a bit of work in the US at the moment, mainly focused on foreign interference. And I think what we can do alone as within the UK is probably quite limited without US backing of whatever we're proposing. But I think there's definitely an opportunity to find common ground, and that I'd suggest that common ground is around this point of foreign interference, yes, and around moving the discussion away from content and focusing on behaviours. First off, in foreign interference, it's one of the only places in the US DoD budget where the US is underspending when it comes to information operations. The US spends about $1 billion a year on countering information operations. China spends around 8 to 10 billion on information operations every year, and Russia spends about half that amount. So it's very likely that, again, unless something unusual happens, which may, given the current politics of the time, that investment in countering foreign interference in information operations as a whole that impacts national security will likely increase. And I think that's a strong role for the UK to partner with the US on. The second point around behaviours, I think it's Meta really framed this language around coordinated inauthentic behaviour. It's their definition, it's their word, it's their term. I think we should probably step back from coordinated inauthentic behaviour to really what kind of we're positioning as coordinated adversarial behaviour. So that includes kind of bot accounts, but also human individuals who are coordinated in a way that is malicious, either to a country as a whole or towards certain individuals, certain communities. And I think looking at behaviours can be quite technical. It can be quite clinical. We don't need to get into really, debates around freedom of expression. It's content agnostic. So someone could be promoting, for instance, DEI, etc. Someone could be, opposing it. But by looking at the behaviours and not necessarily the subject matter, it gives us an agnostic and neutral way of intervening in the information environment. And I think those two are potentially areas of common ground that we can build on. However we work with platforms.
So final question for me, and given what you place as very important in terms of foreign interference, and I think we all would place that as a significant security threat, should we consider the current JD Vance, Elon Musk campaign against the UK, particularly against the government and the Prime Minister, and this push about free speech and the misrepresentation of our free speech laws as foreign interference?
I don't know the specifics of things. Obviously, I'm aware of it, but I think there is some grounds there that because, for example, we can show there's harm. For example, with the riots, if I can go back to the riots, Elon Musk said that the civil war is inevitable. Mm-hmm. We can go back to the data and the access. We can check to see if when he posted that, what happened afterwards. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, say, it's not causal, but you can show by timestamps what happened. With this thing, it's kind of a similar approach whether you can actually show that kind of logical sequencing. So for me, it's more from that perspective. And quite honestly, it's your own jurisdiction. You should have every right to legislate it the way you want because you're protecting your country, your own sovereignty, and this is about that space.
Lyric, do you want to say anything about that?
Not too much to comment on JD or Elon specifically, but I think there's probably a philosophical question here of, is that dream of an open internet, a singular internet now dead? Are we now moving towards, slightly differently walled versions of the internet in every country? And I think it would be a shame if we completely give up on that dream of an open internet that the whole world can communicate through. There's been great power in that over the last couple of decades, and there's great opportunity that lies ahead through AI and other things to keep an internet open. But I think there's each country does have to make a determination on where what its sensitivities are, and it's for that country, its government, its citizens to come to that conclusion. And my view here would be kind of the biggest sensitivity at the moment is areas that promote violence or create these kind of offline harms that incite violence, and areas of foreign interference, and these are kind of areas of low-hanging fruit that we could probably work with any government, any administration on as part of the G7, the G20 to try and continue to keep an open vision of an open internet. But I'd rather not comment on the politics of JD and Elon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question, Emily. I think it's worth emphasising that we in the committee support the open ability to communicate across the internet, and we have very much set out in our terms of reference the support for freedom of speech. We also support the UK's sovereignty as a sovereign nation, and the laws that apply offline, apply online. So part of the question is whether some of these laws and regulations need to be adapted for the unique challenges and the challenges that the online world may present. But you've been very, very helpful in your contribution. I would ask if you have specific, we didn't spend very much time on the Online Safety Act, and if you have specific suggestions as to how the Online Safety Act or the powers within it could be extended or enforced or adopted or interpreted, actually is probably the better word, please could you write to us. But just to finish by saying a huge thank you, I think on behalf of the committee, you've really given us, I think I'm actually more hopeful now, which is not particularly what I expected, but I think you have suggested, both of you in different ways, have suggested areas where the committee could focus recommendations which could make a positive change to the impact of social media and misinformation in this country. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.